finishing up our page on cerebrospinal fluid. Now you can see, this would be the back of someone's head, here are the ears, you can see the lateral ventricles. Let's go ahead and see how much you can recognize. So these are the lateral ventricles in blue, and separating them from each other is the septum pellucidum. Actually, so that you can just see it in these two different views. And then next be the third ventricle, and then after that, in orange, the fourth ventricle. You can color the choroid plexuses in purple. This is where the cerebrospinal fluid is being formed. And then the connections between them in yellow. So they're the interventricular foramen, and then the cerebral aqueduct, and then the apertures that leave the fourth ventricle. Okay, this view is also good because it gives you your first view of the sinuses. So the sinuses are blood-filled spaces that reabsorb cerebrospinal fluid, and then all of that blood flows and enters the jugular veins to drain the head and neck. So wherever I'm going to use blue for this. Actually, I wish I had not gone around. Just leave that side empty. Ideally, I would just have it here and here. And these transverse sinuses. So this is called the transverse sinus. And this part at the top, right through here, is called the superior sagittal sinus. So these are one blood-filled space up here, and then here and here. If you redo your notes or something, I wish I had not colored in the blood here. Not to say there's no blood on the surface of the brain there, but that's not a sinus. So you've got the superior sagittal sinus, and then the transverse sinuses that can reabsorb cerebrospinal fluid. Okay, now we'll take a look up here more closely at the movement of the CSF. So this is the sinus right here from a sagittal view. Maybe we'll use hatch marks, maybe a little easier to color it in. Okay, so all of this is filled with blood back here. And at the top we call it the superior, because it's at the top, sagittal, because it's between the two sides of the cerebrum, sinus, because it's a cavity, and in this case it's blood-filled. And it collects CSF and drains from the head, eventually merging into the jugular veins. And then the transverse sinus here is also important in collecting CSF. Okay, so now we're going to use a pink pen to show where the cerebrospinal fluid is. So it comes out the apertures from the fourth ventricles, and it can go up and around the back of the cerebellum, and it can go up and around the brain in what's called the subarachnoid space. And in the superior sagittal sinus and other sinuses, there are thinned out areas of the subarachnoid space where it dumps into the sinus, into the blood-filled cavity. And then it's a reversal of what happened in the choroid plexus. Now the fluid is pressed back into the low pressure system of the sinus. Okay, so in pink, try to fit all this up at the top here. The CSF flows up and around the brain in the subarachnoid space. And like I mentioned before, we're going to learn about that in coming pages. I'm going to tell you all about the subarachnoid space and where it is and why it's called that. So the fluid moves up and around the subarachnoid space. Sub means below, and then arachnoid means like a spider webbing almost. In the superior sagittal sinus, arachnoid villi, that's these things. Actually, in all of the sinuses of the brain, the blood sinuses, that is. The arachnoid villi allow CSF to rejoin the blood supply. So in the subarachnoid space, this is clear fluid that is pressed back in to the blood supply. So in the choroid plexus, the CSF comes out of the blood supply and into the ventricles. Then it flows from the lateral ventricles to the third ventricle to the fourth ventricle, and then up and around the brain. And in the sinuses, here we can put one in the transverse sinus as well, then that CSF can rejoin the bloodstream. So it's circulating. Okay, another way that the CSF can flow is down the central canal. But this is a really tiny little hole in the middle of your spinal cord. It's not as important for the cushioning, evidently, as the CSF that can go in the subarachnoid space around the spinal cord. And it goes all the way to the bottom of the spinal cord, so if someone needs to have a lumbar puncture, then some of the CF right here can be withdrawn at the bottom of the spinal cord without worrying about damaging the spinal cord itself.